Far above Earth, a small spacecraft was already on its way home. The hardest part seemed finished. Hayabusa had crossed millions of miles of empty space, arrived at a tiny asteroid called Itokawa, and begun the work it had been built to do. From a distance, Itokawa looked less like a world and more like a drifting pile of rubble. Hayabusa hovered nearby, studying its surface, preparing for the moment that would justify years of planning. Success felt close enough to see. The mission only needed to collect material from the asteroid and bring it back to Earth. For the first time, the return journey seemed imaginable. Then the spacecraft began losing pieces of itself. Not physically, at first. Functionally. One of its reaction wheels failed. Then another. These spinning devices helped control the spacecraft's orientation. They were part of the system that allowed Hayabusa to know where it was pointing and to keep itself stable. The mission continued. But one route to success had disappeared. Operations around Itokawa became more difficult. Questions emerged about the sampling process itself. Had material actually been collected? The spacecraft performed the required maneuvers, but certainty became harder to find. Still, Hayabusa remained near the asteroid. Still, the return seemed possible. The damage felt survivable. What mattered was that the spacecraft was alive. Then another option vanished. Control became increasingly fragile. The image of Hayabusa floating above Itokawa had suggested a mission settling into success. The reality was moving in the opposite direction. Every failure removed a capability the spacecraft had been expected to rely upon during the long trip home. The asteroid slowly receded behind it. Earth remained far ahead, and the margin for error kept shrinking. The crisis arrived after departure. Attitude control was lost. The spacecraft began tumbling. Communication weakened and then disappeared. From Earth, mission controllers no longer saw a healthy explorer returning from a distant asteroid. They saw silence. The signal that connected spacecraft and planet was gone. Across millions of miles, Hayabusa became a machine that could not be reliably commanded, could not be properly tracked, and could not easily explain its condition. The story changed in that moment. This was no longer primarily a sample return mission. It became a survival story. Days passed, then weeks. The spacecraft still existed, somewhere in the darkness between planets, but existence and recovery were not the same thing. The central question narrowed. Not whether the mission would succeed, whether the spacecraft could even be reached again. Eventually, a signal returned. Faint. Incomplete. But real. Hayabusa was still there. Across mission control screens, the absence that had defined the crisis was replaced by something smaller but far more valuable. Contact. Relief arrived. Yet the relief had limits. The spacecraft that responded was not the spacecraft that had left Earth. Contact had returned. Capability had not. Hayabusa was damaged. Control remained difficult. Resources were limited. The mission had survived, but survival had not restored what had been lost. The return journey resumed, anyway. For a time, that seemed enough. The spacecraft was moving toward Earth again. The path home still existed. But the contradiction at the center of the mission kept growing stronger. If recovery were truly happening, the spacecraft should have been becoming more capable. Instead, it continued becoming less capable. The closer Earth came, the fewer tools remained available to reach it. Then, another threat emerged. Problems affected the ion propulsion system that was helping carry Hayabusa home. These engines were not a luxury. They were part of the route, part of the remaining future. A mission that had already lost critical control capability now faced new uncertainty in the system responsible for crossing interplanetary space. The temporary explanation for the mission's survival had been simple. Enough of the original spacecraft remained intact, but the evidence no longer fit. Enough surviving hardware should have produced stability. Hayabusa was not stabilizing. Its options were still disappearing. And yet it continued moving toward Earth. The answer was changing. The spacecraft was no longer succeeding because it remained whole. It was succeeding because engineers kept discovering ways to use what was left. Improvisation replaced design. Components that had survived were combined in unconventional ways. Damaged systems were repurposed. Solutions emerged not from restoring the original spacecraft, but from finding new uses for incomplete machinery. The mission stopped asking whether Hayabusa could operate exactly as intended. That possibility was gone. Instead, it asked a different question. What can still work? The distinction mattered, because every surviving function became more valuable after the others disappeared. A traveler crossing a continent might lose a map, then a vehicle, then a phone. The journey changes. The destination does not. Hayabusa was experiencing the same transformation on an interplanetary scale. The return path narrowed, but it did not vanish. Gradually, Earth grew larger. The spacecraft remained damaged.
Against the darkness,
the solutions remained fragile. The mission remained dependent on systems that had already proven vulnerable. Nothing about the situation felt inevitable. The spacecraft only needed to stay alive a little longer. Not forever. Just long enough. As Earth approached, one final objective remained. The capsule. Everything the mission had endured now focused on a small object that would separate from the spacecraft and descend through Earth's atmosphere. Years of failures, recoveries, improvisations, and survival efforts converged on that single moment. If the capsule reached the ground, the mission could succeed even if the spacecraft did not. The distinction had become the entire story. Over Australia, the final sequence began. The capsule separated. It started its descent toward the desert below. Above it, Hayabusa continued forward. The spacecraft that had survived failure after failure entered Earth's atmosphere. Heat built around it. Light spread across the sky. The vehicle that had crossed deep space and somehow remained alive through years of accumulating damage began to break apart. Observers watched fragments streak overhead. The spacecraft was dying. The mission was not. Below, the capsule continued downward. One object burned away. The other survived. Recovery teams located the capsule in the Australian desert. Inside were particles from Itokawa. The mission had done what it set out to do. Not because the spacecraft remained reliable. Not because the failures stopped. Not because enough capability survived unchanged. Hayabusa succeeded because every time a path disappeared, Another had to be created from what remained. At the beginning, the spacecraft was a sample return explorer. By the end, it had become something else. A damaged machine carrying a single remaining possibility home. And in the final image, the meaning of the entire journey becomes visible. High above Australia, the spacecraft burns apart. Below it, the capsule continues toward Earth. The spacecraft does not survive. The mission does,